morning, everybody, or afternoon, whatever time zone you're in. Perfect. I guess forgive the first time jitters, first time with Mint Bean and doing stuff using Hop-In and such. So please forgive anything that seems out of place or odd. So the topic that we were going to go over in today's workshop was, share my screen here, the context API in React. And so I guess we can just dive into it. So I'm just going to reference the docs for the first little bit of this kind of talk workshop to get an idea of what context is, why you might decide to use it, and then some kind of pros or cons, or maybe why you wouldn't use it in your applications, and then sort of juxtapose that with other state management methods like Redux, for example. So context API, or the context in React, is a way to provide or pass down data through the component tree without having to pass down props manually at every level. And if you're at all familiar with React development, you've probably done this yourself. I know I have. It's where you sit in here and you have a prop and a piece of data and you want to get it down even 2 or 3 levels. And then so you're creating props among props and passing it down and down and down. A little noob mistake that I made was, for clarity of mind, when I started doing this, I would have to make a new prop name for every level, which got really confusing and convoluted fast. So this was it was from there that I started using Redux, and that was a really good step up with how to inject the data where you need it. But Redux was a big learning curve for me, and it's got a lot of boilerplate. So if you're not used to anything of this nature, it can be a pretty big jump to try and understand how to start implementing it. And that being said, I was really at the time using Redux just to know it, just to learn it, just to have it as a skill in my tool belt to kind of proclaim on my resume, if you will. So I think for what I was using it for, these demo projects, context API, if I would have known it at the time, would have been a really good thing to use in lieu of Redux. With that being said, it wasn't designed to replace Redux. There was a blog post or something on GitHub. I was reading through a gist that it was a Redux developer actually who said it's not designed to replace Redux, and it's not designed to handle high frequency updates. So you wouldn't use you wouldn't use context to do things like handle the keystrokes of a user's input or something of that nature. The examples that they give are kind of perfect. You might use it for the theme. If there's a theme toggler, you might use your context for that, or for the current authenticated user. That would also be a good use case for the context API. And so what I've done is just kind of got a little application here that's using it, and I got 2 different sort of variations to the application. One that uses the context API with class-based components, and we're going to be using the API as it's described here, using create context, context provider, and context consumer. And then I have one that's sort of the way to go about it. Seems like class-based components are kind of going the way of the dodo. So from there, we'll jump into how to implement it with function-based components, and then React hooks, which is the React hooks are going to kind of just assume a little bit of knowledge because it's out of the scope of this little presentation, but we'll be using things like use context, use reducer, use state, these things. So really quickly, just to take a look at what we got here for the application. It's just nothing more than a little fake shopping cart storefront deal. So you got your list of products here. You can add them to your cart. And then you can see your cart and view it, and you can remove products if you don't want them. And we're keeping some totals up here of your cart. And that's basic. That's basically going on with that. And so the code for that, if I could pull this up. Oh, I'm also I'm going to cancel my video here so we get a better screen view. Okay, so is this visible? Is the VS Code here visible enough for everybody? I'm going to just assume yes here. Perfect. Thanks, Osway, my man. Okay. So basically what you got here is just a standard kind of React pattern app where I just create a class of app. This is just a gutted create React app. So you have your main app feeding into the index. I set up the browser router right here so we could focus on things more pertaining to the React context. So the few API pieces that we're going to be working with in this are going to be the kind of meat and potatoes, which is React create context, context.provider, and context.consumer. You do have these two other methods, API methods available to you, context type and display name, but we're not going to really dive into those for the purposes of this demonstration. This is kind of to get your feet wet with create context and understand how to implement it as it needs to be. So we got our basic app function or app component here. This app component has it maintains its own state, and then we have a couple methods that are a part of it, namely add product to cart and then remove product from cart. And what we're doing is just enacting the logic for those methods right here, all within the app file. And we are then just going to wrap our entire application in the store.provider component. So to back up a little bit, what we've done is created a store context. So I've created this context folder, and in it I've created a store context. This is where you would import React. So you can just do something like create React context. Now, of course, you can put this in the app folder, but to make things a little clearer, I just put it here and exported it. I want to note something, that this is just as well like this. You could just as well create the context and then just leave it like such and export it like this, because create context, all it does is take a default value, but this default value isn't exactly what is passed to the consumers of this context, and I'll get to that in a minute. But for the purposes of auto completion in your IDE, it's not a bad idea to list out or describe the object that you're going to be using right here, because then you get auto completion in your here in VS Code when you're referencing it elsewhere. So React.create context, simple enough. It just creates a context object. When React renders a component that subscribes to this context object, it will read the current context value from the closest matching provider above in the tree. And then this is what I was talking about with the default value not necessarily being what's passed to the providers, or excuse me, the consumers. So back in the app.js file, we're just importing that context we created, and we're using that to wrap our entire app. So the provider, it's from this, creating this element and doing dot provider, that we're able to then get access to that data, this provided data, to every level of the nested component. So any child within the store.provider or your context.provider is going to have access to the data that you pass in. The provider has a single prop here. It's called value. And this is where you're actually providing the value that you want to have access to. This object is what we're going to be able to reference in the consumer components. So the logic for these values here is what I'm handling in the state and the method properties of this app class. So the add product to cart, remove product from cart, and then our state here, which is nothing more than the products available, and then our empty cart right now. This is what's being passed into this value prop as an object, and this is what we're going to use to reference in the various consumers. So far we've hit the create context and the provider. This works very similar to other things you could be familiar with if you're using Redux. But when we're wanting to access those things in our carts and products, this is where we are going to do our consumer. So if you notice, I'm doing the same thing. I'm bringing in my context that I created, and I'm just saying .consumer. So from here is where things get slightly tricky. Not really though. So consumer actually dynamically renders out a function beneath it. So instead of just immediately putting in your component or your JSX, what you're actually doing is returning a function. This function gets access to that value that we provided in the dot provider. So this value that we put in right here is what's being passed to the consumer value prop or value function, I should say. So it's from that we're able to access the various properties of that object, which in this case, in the products file, all I'm looking to do is map over those products and then list those out to be able to be viewed in the UI. So that's all well and good. You can pretty much take it from there with common React development patterns. We're just doing an on-click and we're referencing the context add product method. We're passing the item into that because that's what we wanted to receive in the logic of that item. And I mean, this is basically how it works. So you pretty much understand now how to implement context as a state management system in your applications. It doesn't really get too more complex than that if you don't want it to. I want you to kind of take notice of a few things though. In these class-based components, when I'm using class, we're wrapping our JSX that we're returning in this render function in the store context .consumer component. So this is going to be the different how you would implement it differently in these class-based components. And this is I don't know if I'm comfortable enough or aware enough to say this is the old way to do it, but there seems to be a better way to do this. Feel free to maximize it. Boom. Okay. So again, I just wanted you to take notice of how we're implementing this, the data that we're passing into the value.provider. We're wrapping our JSX in a .consumer, store context .consumer, which gives us a function. That function takes in the value data that we passed in, the value object, which we can then reference in our JSX and do what we want with it. So is that the only way to implement it? Wrapping our stuff in a store context .consumer? No, that's not. If you're using, now this would be specific to class methods. This way is something that you can use in both function and class methods, wrapping your JSX in the .consumer component. There is a class method specific way that you can also use to implement this stuff. And this is with a static method of context type. And what we're doing is no different than before. We're importing the store context that we created. And then we're giving this static context type method to our class. This is a reserved word. So this is all stuff handled on the back end of React. So this will allow us to access this .context through this static method. Now, the benefits of this is if I wanted to do some logic or do something with the stuff I'm bringing into this component, this is how I would have to do it in the class-based method. If you take notice, in the other ways where I'm wrapping it, I only have access to that context in this rendered out block of code. I don't have access to it up here to do stuff with it, which you may want. So one way to get around that in class-based components is to bring in this static method, context type, set that equal to the store context that you created, or the content, whatever it is that you created. And then from here, you can get your lifestyle method or life cycle methods, bring those into play, or whatever you might want to do with the data. So real quick, I'm just gonna, when would you use context over Redux? Josue, I'm gonna talk about that in just a moment. So kind of hold on to that. And forgive me if I take a while to get to the questions. I'm gonna try and jump back to the chat every few moments here. Okay, so this is the class-based approach, or when you would generally implement this through class-based components. And that's all well and good, but it seems to be the old way of doing things. So instead of doing that, let's see how you could go ahead and implement this in, oh, excuse me, it looks like we were actually using the, well, we were using actually not these methods. We were using the components that was functional components. So this whole demonstration you've seen thus far has been actually with what we're about to look at now. So I'll just go ahead and bring that back. So to kind of compare what we got going on here, I'm going to open up two windows here. So now bringing it back to functional components. On this left side here, you can see I'm just working with a functional component as opposed to the class-based component, and there's a few notable changes taking place here. One, I've outsourced all this logic, this state management and the logic for these methods. I've outsourced them. And I've pretty much, all I've done is created a global state component. And you can see this here in my context folder, global state component. And this is where I'm bringing in my store context. Store context is just the same thing there. I'm just doing this again for auto completion. This could be a blank object, but I get the IntelliSense in VS Code if I do this. So the advantages of doing it how you're seeing now is, for one, kind of cleanliness of code. This app file, with it not being cluttered up with logic and all that, seems to be a way more elegant way to approach this, as opposed to just dumping everything in your app file. So the difference is not only that we're using a function component, but we're outsourcing the logic, and we're just wrapping our entire app in this component that we've created. So this is where I'm going to handle all that stuff. And notice we're using hooks in these function components as well. But all I'm doing is passing, again, the store context.provider, and I'm just wrapping all the props.children to it. So it's the same, we're passing the data to the components in the same fashion with the store context.provider. Again, providing it with just the object that we want to give it, which is the same thing, except we're just exporting, again, logic. Instead of doing it all here, I have a reducers file. This is to kind of give a little bit of, if you're familiar with Redux, this is the same pattern. We're just bringing in a reducers file, creating that, and this is where we're going to be handling the logic for the various methods. The difference is there's no actions really with this. We're kind of handling it all right here. Let's get back to the components here. So products. To compare the two components we got here, the function-based component with the class-based component, we're doing, instead of wrapping our component with this store context.consumer, what we're going to do is go ahead and use the use context hook. So this just seems to be way more elegant. I mean, all we're doing is bringing in a simple hook. We're passing the context that we provided, store context, to it. And then so this is now the object that we can reference that has our values on it and methods. So in the same way, instead of this context that we're referencing, what we're doing is passing it this context here. So an immediate plus to this is we're not having to nest a function within a component, and that function that returns a JSX. We're removing two levels of nesting in this component alone. We're no longer needing this function to put everything in. We're also no longer needing to nest that within a consumer. So the reason for that, again, is because if we take a look at the global state here, everything is being passed into it right here with this provider. So let's, I guess the reason I'm showing you this is I just want to highlight the differences in approaches. These two are functionally the same, but this one is just much cleaner. You have a smaller component, and you're removing two levels of nesting in the component itself. The difference being is, other than this is a function and this is a class, is you don't have to mess with with these things. You're bringing it in through the context hook. And this isn't really, again, about hooks, so I'm just going to assume you can look this up in the docs. Basically, the basic use is you bring it in and you can pass your provider to it. Just the same for the cart. We are doing the same thing. Again, this was the static context method, so a different way to implement it. But you don't have to deal with static methods, for one, if you're not too familiar with how they work. I mean, this is a basic implementation of it, but that's just another thing to learn. But once again, you basically, these look to be pretty much the same outside of that, but you're no longer having to deal with the class, which is gonna work well more in the efficiency. I think classes are a little bit more resource intensive when it comes to rendering out React components. The last one would be the totals. Oh. And this is pretty much the same. What I wanted to highlight in this one, if you'll notice, this is a class component, or excuse me, a functional component, is you can still wrap this component in a store context.consumer. If you didn't want to bring in use context here. Okay. If you didn't want to do this, you can still get access to it with the store.consumer component. But then again, you're dealing with having to then pass this function down to it, which returns the JSX you're looking to return. So it seems to be just a more elegant and clean way to just forget this entirely and just use your React hooks. Boom, boom, boom. React, what's this? totals.js. Oh. Okay, so let me check the chat real quick. Could you explain on why context shouldn't be used for apps with state that is expected to change frequently when you use context? So the basic understanding is React, the context API, to get to both kind of your question, Peter, and your question, Josue, is that context, anything that is a child of the context provider, re-renders on every single state change. So when we're looking at this component here, this is our main app file. Anything that is inside this provider, so all these components, every single one of these are going to be re-rendered at any change in this value here. And so this is the drawback. This is why you wouldn't use context. So to kind of circle back around, Josue, context would be better used for low frequency changes and where you don't have huge amounts of data. I guess you could say now where data becomes huge, I guess is really up to you. But the general idea is context is, and to quote the React developer or the person who develops React, works on their team, is not meant to replace Redux. So they still have their places where you might use one implementation of high frequency changes and context would be using class-based components where you handle state of, say, like keystrokes in the class component of say a form. So you would still kind of handle that local form state right here, and that can deal with keystrokes or form inputs or whatever, and then you could somehow swing that into context API to the context API and the states that you're managing in the context as well. So there are implementations of context and class components that you could choose to not use Redux instead of using Redux. So one of the things to think about when you're looking to choose whether to use Redux or not is Redux is just another dependency. It's just another, what do we got? I guess I don't have Redux here, but what, three dependencies, and so that's node modules, and then that's another one or two levels of abstraction for your data, and then you're looking at your reducers folder, your actions folder, a store component. So the boilerplate, if you're at all familiar with Redux, is kind of fairly intense, and so it's a lot easier to get started with the context API. And then if you're just doing things like managing form input keystrokes, maybe the state of a class-based component will suit you just fine. And you don't even need to use class-based components. Actually, you could just use the use state hook, which works very similar to how you would manage state in a class-based component. So yeah, does anybody else have any kind of questions regarding what we've kind of demonstrated here? See if it works just the same. Boom. Yeah. Well, I guess that's really it. I don't really have too much more to dive into. What I might suggest for anybody who's looking to start implementing this, if they don't have a background knowledge of context, would just be to go over the docs. It's very pretty clear documentation on how to get started with this. And again, it's pretty simple to use. And what I also might suggest is, if you're not familiar with them, getting into React hooks, because in the documentation, they are showing classes with this. But like I said, it seems to be like classes are kind of going the way of the dodo with the advent of hooks. So maybe start looking into implementing the hooks as well. So these, by the way, hooks are what you're going to use in lieu of your life cycle components, as well as your constructor, state, function. So yeah, let's see what we got here. Backstage. Common pitfalls of developers switching from classes to hooks. Well, let's see. Common pitfalls might be, pull this back up. You know, I don't know that there are too many common pitfalls. I can't really say from experience anyway. If I had to take a guess, for anybody who's moving from classes to hooks, it might be just making the mental switch on state with using hooks. It may be a little bit confusing to implement maybe a little bit more robust state object, but I don't know that there's really too many pitfalls. Hooks seem to be fairly straightforward. I don't know if anybody thinks that there are common pitfalls. Please point them out in the chat. I would be interested in hearing what people have to say about that. Well, let's see here. Feel free. Well, got done, I suppose, before an hour, but I don't really have too much more to talk about. I could word vomit for a while, but I don't know it'd be useful. So, maybe we could, unless anybody would like to, ask questions or join in on the chat, just kind of wrap it up. I'll give people just a few moments here to respond. I know there's a delay. Awesome. Yeah. So I guess, again, my name was Cody. I appreciate your patience and allowing me to talk at you about this. I hope you gain some understanding from it, because it really is for us to look through. I could push this up to GitHub if that would be useful. If you guys aren't already in the Mint Bean Discord, what I'll do is I'll post that in the Mint Bean Discord. So I know we got a couple organizers available here, and I'll just kind of touch base with them about it. But I'll make the GitHub available in the Mint Bean Discord after I get it up on GitHub. So yeah, again, thank you for letting me talk at you. I apologize for the jitters if you noticed any. Hopefully I'll be able to do this again, and best of luck in the use of context.